They say in China you must respect your ancestors, but you must fear the ones who were never allowed to rest. They aren't simply dead, they are the Jiangshi. I didn't come to Xi'an to see the terracotta army. I came to find a missing scientist, a former colleague the agency had wiped from every record. But my search intersected with a local horror story. A crew of tomb raiders had awakened something in a forgotten ancient tomb. Now, strange deaths are spreading, and the villagers whisper of stiff corpses hopping through the darkness to steal the breath of the living. This is the story of my journey into the heart of an ancient curse. A fight, not just against the deadly traps within the tomb, but against an army of the undead commanded by a brutal general. I came looking for one man, but now I must seal a tomb before its army consumes everything. The air in Xi'an tasted of coal dust, history, and the frantic energy of a city that never decided if it belonged to the past or the future. Ancient city walls stood defiantly against a skyline of glittering high-rises. I wasn't here for the terracotta warriors or the tourists. I was a ghost hunting another ghost. The trail had grown cold weeks ago, leading me from a safe house in Bangkok to this historical heart of China. My target, Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a brilliant but morally flexible bioengineer, a former colleague from my life at the agency, a life I only remembered in violent, disjointed flashes. The last trace of him was a corrupted data fragment, a final satellite ping from a rural coordinate somewhere in the Jiangshi province. Then, silence. I sat in a crowded tea house, the scent of jasmine tea mingling with the street-level haze, scrolling through local news feeds on a burner tablet. My search for Tanaka had been a dead end so far, but I'd learned patience. You watch, you listen, and eventually, the world gives you something. Today, it did. The article was small, buried under stories of economic development. A group of suspected tomb raiders had illegally excavated an undiscovered Qin Dynasty tomb in a remote village. The raiders had vanished without a trace. Authorities were investigating, but the locals weren't talking. That was the official story. The real story was in the hushed conversations at the tables around me. I didn't need to be fluent in Mandarin to understand the universal language of fear. I picked out words. Missing. Cold. Pale skin. Then, a word whispered with a reverence that bordered on terror, a word I had to cross-reference with the folklore section of my notebook. Coke. Jiangshi. My logical mind immediately supplied the translation, stiff corpse. The West would call them vampires or zombies, but the local lore was more specific. Reanimated corpses, rigor mortis, never leaving their bodies, forcing them to move by hopping with outstretched arms. They were blind, but drawn to the breath of the living, which they would steal to sustain their unnatural existence. It was fascinating, a perfect case study in mass hysteria. A campfire story to explain a tragedy. But the agency didn't deal in campfire stories. They dealt in weaponizing them. On a hunch, I pulled up the coordinates from Tanaka's last signal. I overlaid them on a map of the region, then pinpointed the village mentioned in the news report. My breath caught. They weren't just close. They were practically the same location. The pieces slammed together with a sickening certainty. Tanaka, a specialist in cellular regeneration and reanimation. A newly unearthed tomb from an era steeped in mysticism and alchemy, a group of tomb raiders who vanish, followed by strange deaths. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a field test. Hauk. I paid for my tea and stood up, the tea house's warmth feeling suddenly false. The data card I'd recovered in Indonesia had mentioned the agency's interest in reanimation protocols. It seemed Tanaka had found the perfect laboratory. My search for a missing man had just become a mission to contain his work, and I had a chilling feeling that his work was just starting to wake up. The bus ride from Xi'an felt like a journey back in time. Paved highways gave way to dirt roads, and skyscrapers were replaced by dusty fields and small, gray brick farmhouses. The village was nestled in the crook of a low mountain range, shrouded in a persistent mist that clung to the tiled roofs. The air here wasn't just quiet, it was muted, as if the entire village was holding its breath. Every door I passed was adorned with a yellow paper talisman, painted with intricate red characters I didn't recognize. The few villagers I saw in the streets scurried away at my approach, their faces tight with fear and suspicion. This wasn't just a community in mourning, it was a community under siege. I found the local constable, a weary, chain-smoking man named Officer Wei, in a small, cramped office. He was reluctant to speak to an outsider, but my fabricated credentials as a cultural anthropologist and a subtle flash of cash loosened his tongue. He took me to the home of the latest victim. The scene was unsettlingly clean. The victim, a young farmer, lay on his bed, his eyes wide open with a final, unblinking terror. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, save for 2 small, almost surgical puncture marks on his neck. What was truly unnerving was his body. It was rigid, unnaturally stiff, his limbs locked in place. Officer Wei called it a strange, aggressive form of rigor mortis. I knew it was something else. As darkness fell, Officer Wei urged me to lock myself in my guest house room and not open the door for any reason. I thanked him for his concern, then immediately disregarded his advice. I needed to see this thing for myself. I found a spot in a darkened alleyway that gave me a clear view of the village square, and I waited. Moo. The night was deathly still for hours. Then I heard it, a rhythmic, muffled thump, thump, thump. It was a heavy, dragging sound, getting closer. From the shadows at the edge of the village, a figure emerged. It was a man in modern, tattered clothes, but he moved with a horrifying, rigid gait, his arms outstretched before him. He wasn't walking, he was hopping, each jump covering an unnatural distance with a stiff-legged bounce. His skin was tinged a sickly, pale green in the moonlight. One of the Tomb Raiders. He seemed to be sniffing the air, his head turning jerkily from side to side. He was hunting. I held my breath, a trick I'd learned instinctively, and he hopped past my hiding spot, seemingly unaware. He stopped in front of a small house, raised his arms and prepared to smash through the door. That's when I moved. I lunged from the alley, aiming a heavy kick at his side. It was like kicking a concrete statue. He barely flinched, turning his head slowly to face me. His eyes were milky white, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. He attacked with a speed that defied his stiff movements. I dodged a clumsy but powerful swing of his arms, the wind of his passage chilling my skin. My punches, aimed at his torso and head, had little to no effect. It felt like hitting solid oak. I drew my knife and plunged it into his shoulder. The blade sank in, but there was no reaction, no blood. He simply kept coming. I changed tactics. Instead of trying to injure him, I focused on his balance. I swept his legs out from under him, sending him toppling to the ground with a heavy thud. He lay there, limbs twitching, trying to right himself but unable to bend. He was immobilized, but not defeated. Salve. I stood over the thrashing creature, my heart pounding. My knife was useless. My strength was barely enough to knock it down. This wasn't a fight I could win with brute force. This was a puzzle, a biological and supernatural lock. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I didn't have the key. Brute force had failed. The image of the twitching, immobilized corpse in the alley was burned into my mind. It was a lock I couldn't pick, a machine I couldn't break. I needed a blueprint. I needed knowledge. Neurus. My next conversation with Officer Wei was different. I didn't use my cover story. I described what I had fought, its unnatural rigidity, its imperviousness to my knife. Fear, raw and genuine, flickered in his eyes. He finally relented, telling me that when problems arose that the government couldn't solve, the old ones in the village would whisper of a Taoist temple on the slopes of the nearby mountain. A place run by a master named Chen, whose family had supposedly watched over these lands for dynasties. The climb was arduous. Stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of rain and pilgrims, snaked up the mountainside. The air grew thinner, cleaner. scented with pine and damp earth. As I ascended, the modern world fell away, replaced by mist and silence. The temple wasn't large, just a simple, elegant structure of dark wood and gray tile, its corners gracefully upturned towards the sky. An old man was sweeping the courtyard with a bamboo broom. His robes were simple, his back slightly stooped, but his eyes, when they met mine, were sharp and intelligent. "The mountain is closed to outsiders," he said, his voice calm but firm, not even pausing his sweeping. "I'm not a tourist," I replied, staying at the courtyard's edge. "I came because of the Jiangshi." He stopped. "You use a name you do not understand. I understand that it's 5'9", has a pale green complexion, and doesn't respond to a blade in its clavicle," I said flatly. "I also understand that it can't see you if you hold your breath." That last part got his full attention. He leaned his broom against the temple wall and studied me for a long moment. "You fought one, and you survived. How?" "I tripped it," I said. "It can't get up. A flaw in its design. A flicker of something. Amusement? Respect?" crossed his face. "You think like an engineer, not a warrior. Come." He led me inside. The temple was sparse, filled with the scent of old parchment and sandalwood. Master Chen explained that his ancestors were tasked with guarding the tomb, not its treasures, but its occupant. The Jiangshi were cursed souls, trapped between life and death by a powerful ritual. They were terrified of the sun, drawn to the life force, the qi, in a living person's breath. "They are not alive, so you cannot kill them," he explained, gesturing to a rack of wooden swords. "You must subdue them, interrupt the dark energy that animates them." He pointed to a sack in the corner. "Glutinous rice. It is sticky, impure to their cursed nature. It clings to them, slows them." He picked up one of the swords. "Peachwood, from a sacred tree. It harms their spiritual form, not just their physical one." Finally, he led me to a small table where he was in the process of painting yellow paper talismans. "And this is the key. The fulu, a seal. Placed upon its forehead, it freezes the curse. It makes the body dormant once more." His expression turned grim. "But these are just soldiers." The tomb raiders awoke the entire garrison. The true danger is the one they were buried to serve, General Taimu, a tyrant of the Qin Dynasty, so brutal that his emperor cursed him to guard his treasures even in death. If he is not sealed, his will shall drive his army out of the mountains and into the world. He gathered a stack of finished talismans and pressed them into my hand along with a straight, unadorned peach wood sword. The wood was unnaturally light but felt incredibly dense. "I am a guardian of knowledge, no longer a man of war," Master Chen said, his eyes filled with a deep ancestral weariness. "But you have the strength I have lost. The tomb must be sealed. The general must be silenced." I had come to China to hunt a man. Now I had to hunt a general and his legion of the dead. The curse was spreading like a plague. What started as one or two isolated incidents had become a nightly siege. The villagers who had been attacked, the ones with the small puncture wounds on their necks, fell into a deep, feverish sleep from which they never awoke. Then, the following night, they would rise. Their skin would turn pale, their limbs would lock, and they would join the growing legion of the hopping dead. The village had become a fortress, but its walls were made of fear and superstition. Every night, the rhythmic, horrifying thump, thump, thump of the Jiangshi would echo from the surrounding fields, a slow, patient drumbeat of doom. The villagers huddled in their homes, praying behind their paper talismans. Master Chen, it turned out, was not entirely a man of peace. He descended from his mountain temple not as a warrior, but as a commander. While I possessed the raw physical ability, he possessed the strategy, born from centuries of his family's knowledge. We became an unlikely duo, the last line of defense for a village teetering on the brink of annihilation. My combat training, once reliant on firearms and steel, underwent a rapid, bizarre evolution. I learned to fight with new weapons. I filled small cloth bags with the glutinous rice, using them like grenades. A direct hit would cause a Jiangshi to recoil as if struck by acid, the sticky grains adhering to its skin and disrupting its energy. The peachwood sword felt feather-light in my hand, but when I struck a Jiangshi, it left a smoking, blackened scar where my combat knife had done nothing. The most critical skill was breath control. They were blind, hunting only by sensing the qi in our breath. I learned to fight in short, explosive bursts, holding my breath to become invisible, striking, and then retreating to gasp for air before they could pinpoint my location. It was a deadly dance of action and stillness. Hosata, the tree Darius. We worked through the night, a two-man army against the dead. Master Chen, with his calm demeanor and precise movements, would place talismans on the foreheads of the slower ones, freezing them in mid-hop. I would handle the more aggressive ones, using the rice and the peachwood sword to herd them, to break their formations, to create openings. We saved the village, but only for one more night. Each dawn, we would count the cost. More empty homes, more missing people. As the sun rose after the third night of fighting, the reality of our situation was stark. We stood amidst the dozen or so frozen Jiangshi we had managed to subdue, their paper talismans fluttering in the morning breeze. We were exhausted, our supplies of rice and talismans dwindling. "This is not sustainable," I said, my voice hoarse. "We're plugging a leak in a dam that's about to burst." Master Chen nodded, his gaze fixed on the mountain pass that led to the tomb. "You are right, we are merely trimming the branches. The root of this evil remains untouched." He looked at me, his ancient eyes filled with a grim resolve. "The defensive seals are failing. The general's power grows stronger with every soul he claims. There is only one way to end this." He didn't need to say it, I already knew. We couldn't wait for the army to come to us anymore. We had to go to the army. We had to enter the tomb, find the general, and sever the head of the serpent. The entrance to the tomb wasn't a grand archway. It was a crude, muddy hole ripped into the side of the mountain, a profane scar left by the tomb raiders. As Master Chen and I stepped past its threshold, the world changed. The humid night air was replaced by a profound, grave cold that had nothing to do with the mountain's altitude. The air was dead, still, and heavy with the dust of centuries. My breath misted in front of me, and the beam of my tactical flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness just a few feet ahead. "Hold your breath when you can," Chen whispered, his own voice a dry rasp. "The qi of death is thick here. It will weaken the living." The tunnels were a masterclass in ancient paranoia. Chen, with his deep knowledge of dynastic history and symbolism, would spot the almost invisible signs of danger. A slight discoloration on the wall near a pressure plate. A nearly invisible tripwire made of silk, meant to trigger a volley of poison-tipped crossbow bolts from hidden slits in the walls. My role was to be the instrument of his knowledge, my modern reflexes and tactical training allowing me to disarm or bypass the mechanisms he identified. We navigated a hallway where the floor tiles were designed to collapse under the weight of an armored man, forcing us to trace a winding path that only the tomb's architects would have known. We crossed a narrow, crumbling stone bridge over a chasm that fell away into absolute blackness. The greatest challenge came in a large, circular chamber, where a silent, silver river flowed through the center. Mercury. Its surface rippled under the beam of my light, beautiful and utterly lethal. A hidden path of stone pillars lay just beneath the surface, and only by following the sequence of constellations painted on the ceiling, a map Chen was able to decipher, could we cross without disturbing the toxic liquid. It was on the other side of the Mercury River, in a small antechamber, that we found him. He lay crumpled against the far wall, his body contorted. He wore modern tactical gear, starkly out of place against the ancient stone. It was Dr. Kenji Tanaka, There were no puncture marks on his neck. Instead, a slim bronze dart protruded from his chest. He hadn't been killed by a Jiangshi. He had been killed by the tomb's own defenses, an irony that wasn't lost on me. Beside him lay a military-grade tablet, its screen shattered by the impact of his fall. Useless. But as I knelt beside the body, my training kicked in. I scanned his gear, my fingers finding the small, waterproof slot on the side of the device. My heart gave a small, cold leap. The memory card was still there. I carefully ejected the small data card, securing it in a pouch on my belt. I had found my target. And I had found, I hoped, the evidence I needed. But there was no time for relief. We were deep in enemy territory, and the master of this tomb was still waiting. The tunnel opened into a cavern so vast my flashlight beam couldn't find the far wall. The air was dry and still, and the ground was perfectly level. Arrayed before us in silent, orderly ranks were hundreds of statues. They weren't the life-sized, world-famous warriors of Xi'an, but smaller, more crudely fashioned figures, each about shoulder height. A silent, terracotta army standing guard in the eternal darkness. The general's honor guard, Master Chen breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread, crafted to serve him in the afterlife. We moved cautiously between the silent ranks. The sheer number of them was unnerving. Their faces were blank, featureless canvases, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that their empty eyes were following our every move. We were halfway across the cavern when a low, grinding sound echoed through the chamber, like stone grating against stone. I froze, sweeping my light across the ranks. One of the statues, which had been facing forward, had now turned its head to look directly at us. Then another, and another. A ripple of movement passed through the silent army. With a collective groan of cracking clay, a dozen of the closest warriors stepped out of formation, their movements stiff and jerky, but unnervingly deliberate. They weren't Jiangshi, they were something else. Golems. Earthen automatons, brought to life by some ancient mechanism. "The central floor plate! It's a trigger!" Chen shouted, pointing to a large, circular stone disc in the middle of the cavern floor that we had just crossed. "They are bound to it! I must find the deactivation seal." While he ran towards the far side of the chamber, frantically scanning the walls for the controlling runes, the terracotta soldiers advanced on me. I drew my peach wood sword, but a test swing against the first one's arm resulted in a dull thud and a puff of dust. The sword, designed to combat spiritual energy, was useless against solid clay. I switched to my knife, but it was like trying to carve a brick. These things didn't feel pain. They didn't bleed, they didn't have vital organs. They were pure, relentless force. The fight became a brutal exercise in physics. I couldn't destroy them, so I had to dismantle them. I used their own weight and momentum against them, tripping one into another, shattering them like giant earthenware pots. I dodged their heavy, sweeping blows from clay halberds and swords, using my knife to pry at their joints, trying to sever an arm or a leg. It was exhausting, punishing work. More of them were activating, stepping out of the ranks to join the fray. I was being herded, pushed back. Just as I was about to be overwhelmed, I heard Chen cry out in triumph. "I have it!" He slammed his palm against a large rune carved into the wall. A deep hum vibrated through the floor, and the advancing terracotta warriors froze in place, their clay limbs locking mid-swing. A few of the damaged ones crumbled into piles of dust and broken pottery. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood panting amidst the carnage, leaning on my knees. We had survived. But as I looked ahead, my relief vanished. A massive stone portcullis, a gate of solid rock, had descended from the ceiling, blocking the tunnel we were heading for. We had triggered a final lockdown. There was no going back. The only path left was a grand, ornate doorway at the far end of the cavern, a door that could only lead to one place. The heart of the tomb, the general's throne room. The grand doors groaned open into the main burial chamber. It was a vast, circular room, the walls covered in faded murals depicting scenes of conquest and slaughter. But my attention wasn't on the walls, it was on what stood in the chamber. In the exact center of the room rested a massive black stone sarcophagus, intricately carved with dragons and screaming faces. And surrounding it, arranged in silent concentric circles, stood the general's true army, not terracotta, but flesh. Hundreds of Jiangshi, perfectly preserved in the ancient armor of Qin Dynasty soldiers, stood motionless. Their skin was a pale, bluish gray, their eyes were closed, and their arms were held rigidly at their sides. The air was thick with a silent, malevolent energy, a sleeping power waiting for a command. "The general," Master Chen whispered, his hand tightening on the final, most powerful talisman he had prepared. "We must seal him before he awakens." But we were too late. As if our very presence had broken a delicate stasis, a loud crack echoed through the chamber. The heavy lid of the stone sarcophagus slid open with a grinding groan. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure rose from within. He was immense, a full head taller than any of his soldiers, and clad in ornate, black lacquered armor that seemed to drink the light from my flashlight. His face was a mask of cold, arrogant cruelty, preserved perfectly by the curse. His eyes snapped open, and they weren't the milky white of his soldiers. They were glowing with a faint crimson light. General Taimu had awakened. He opened his mouth, and a guttural, terrifying roar erupted from his chest, a commander's battle cry that echoed with centuries of rage. In unison, the eyes of his entire army snapped open. 100 pairs of milky white orbs turned towards us. With a collective, horrifying groan, they raised their arms and began to hop, their movements perfectly synchronized, a unified wave of death closing in on us. The final battle had begun. "Buy me time!" Chen yelled, taking a defensive stance and beginning a complex, rapid chant, his voice weaving a shield of spiritual energy that seemed to cause the closest Jiangshi to recoil. I must weaken his connection to them. My job was simpler and harder. I had to carve a path through a sea of the undead to get to the general. It was a nightmare of controlled chaos. I moved like a blur, my peachwood sword a flickering arc in the darkness. I didn't try to fight them all. I used my knowledge of their limitations, nimbly dodging between them, using their stiff movements to my advantage. I became a ghost in their midst, holding my breath, striking, moving, breathing, then vanishing again. I used bags of rice to create temporary barriers, the sticky grains causing them to stumble and falter, breaking their perfect formations. But for every one I dodged or knocked aside, 2 more would take its place. I was being driven back, the circle tightening. Through the mass of bodies, I could see the general, standing motionless beside his sarcophagus, watching the battle with an intelligent, malevolent gaze. He was the nexus. He was the target. I was running out of time and energy. I needed a distraction. Something big. Something they wouldn't expect. My hand brushed against my pocket and felt the familiar, rectangular shape of my Zippo lighter. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in my mind. The murals on the walls depicted a river, the Mercury River we had crossed, but they also showed soldiers pouring oil into it and setting it ablaze during a battle. The air in here was ancient, dry, and potentially filled with flammable gases from the tomb's decay. With a final burst of energy, I fought my way clear of the main horde, vaulting over a fallen soldier. I raised my Zippo high, its familiar click echoing strangely in the vast chamber. I flicked the wheel. A single, defiant flame sprang to life. I threw it, not at the general, but at a section of the wall where the ancient paint was peeling, near a fissure seeping a faint, oily vapor. The result was more spectacular than I could have hoped. A pocket of trapped methane ignited with a deafening whoosh. A fireball erupted along the wall, momentarily bathing the entire chamber in a brilliant, searing light. The Jiangshi, creatures of darkness, shrieked and recoiled from the sudden, intense flame. Even the general, for one crucial second, was stunned, raising an armored arm to shield his glowing eyes from the unexpected sun. It was the opening I needed. The fireball roared, and then subsided, leaving flickering afterimages dancing in my vision. But that one brilliant second was all Master Chen needed. While the general was blinded, and his army in disarray, the old Taoist moved with a speed that defied his age. He darted past the stunned guards, his simple robes flowing behind him, the final, potent talisman held between two fingers like a sacred dart. He reached the general just as the crimson glow returned to the creature's eyes. Before the tyrant could issue another command, Chen lunged forward and slapped the yellow paper seal firmly onto the center of his forehead. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The general froze solid, his armored body locked in place, an enraged roar dying in his throat as a silent gasp. The crimson light in his eyes flickered once, then extinguished, leaving them dark and lifeless. The connection was severed. And across the chamber, a chain reaction occurred. As one, the entire army of Jiangshi stopped dead in their tracks. Their heads drooped. A low collective sigh, like the sound of sand pouring onto stone, filled the room. Then they began to crumble. Their ancient armor clattered to the floor as the cursed flesh within turned to fine, gray dust, centuries of undeath finally claiming their due. Within moments, all that remained of the general's mighty army was a collection of empty armor and piles of ash. Our victory was short-lived. The destruction of the central curse had broken the magic that held the tomb together. A deep, grinding tremor shook the very foundations of the chamber. Dust and chunks of rock began to rain down from the ceiling. Cracks snaked across the floor. The entire mountain was collapsing in on itself. "We must leave! Now!" Chen yelled over the deafening roar of crumbling stone. There was no time for finesse. We sprinted, vaulting over piles of empty armor and dodging falling debris. The tomb, which had been a deadly maze on the way in, was now a linear, suicidal race against time. We scrambled through the chamber of the defeated terracotta warriors, past the silent Mercury River, and back through the trapped hallways. We burst out of the muddy entrance and into the cool night air just as a final, catastrophic groan echoed from within. The entire mountainside above the entrance gave way, burying the tomb under thousands of tons of rock and earth. The resting place of General Taimu was now sealed more securely than any curse could have managed. It was silent once more. Efad Guldua Falai Bavees. We stood there, panting in the pre-dawn light, watching the dust settle. As the first rays of the sun crested the mountains, I pulled the small data card from my belt. Later, in the relative safety of my guest house, I would access its contents. The encrypted files contained Kenji Tanaka's final chilling report. He had confirmed the legends. He had detailed the Jiangshi's resilience, their obedience to a central commander, and their potential as a biological weapon. His final entry was a message intended for Marcus Thorne. Protocol successful. The asset is viable, ready for extraction and replication study. The agency didn't just know about the tomb, they had intentionally triggered its awakening. They wanted an army of the dead. I looked at Master Chen, who was gazing at the sealed tomb with a look of profound, weary peace. He had saved his ancestral home. I, on the other hand, had just found a new front in my war. I thanked the old master, a silent understanding passing between us. He had his duty, and I had mine. My hunt for answers had ended. My hunt for justice was just beginning.